The morning Inez Quinn walked into the land office in Coldwater Creek, Texas, with her 4-year-old son balanced on her hip in desperation, stitched into every line of her face. The last thing she expected was for the quiet man leaning against the far wall to change the entire course of her life. It was the spring of 1878, and Coldwater Creek sat at the edge of the Texas Hill Country like a town that had not quite decided whether it wanted to survive or simply blow away with the next dry wind. The streets were packed dirt, the storefronts weathered and sun-bleached, and the people who lived there wore the particular brand of weariness that came from scratching a living out of unforgiving land. It was not a place that tolerated weakness, and it was not a place that was kind to women alone. Inez had known that before she arrived. She had known it in Laredo, where she had buried Thomas Quinn 3 months prior, and she had known it in San Antonio, where she had stopped long enough to sell the last of Thomas's belongings for stage fare north. Thomas had not been a bad man exactly. He had been a restless one, a man who chased promises the way other men chased cattle, always one town ahead of the life he owed his family. He had given Inez his name when she was 20 years old and already carrying their son, and she had been grateful for that at least. But the name was all he had managed to leave behind before a fever took him fast and without ceremony in a boarding house room that smelled of coal smoke and regret. The boy's name was Cody. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and he was small for his age, which worried Inez in the way that only a mother who had counted her last coins the night before could truly worry. He clung to her shoulder now as she stepped up to the land office counter, his face half buried against her neck. "I am here about the posting," Inez said to the man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow named Grover who looked at her the way most men in Coldwater Creek looked at a woman traveling alone, which was to say with a mixture of pity and suspicion that she found equally insulting. The advertisement in the San Antonio paper. Someone in Coldwater Creek was seeking a wife. Grover scratched the back of his neck. "That would be Hugh Alden's posting, ma'am. He come in himself to have it written up." He glanced at the boy, then back at her. "You ought to know the posting didn't mention anything about a child." "No," Inez said, keeping her voice steady. "It did not. Hugh might have something to say about that." "He might," she agreed. "Is he here?" It was then that the quiet man at the far wall straightened up, and Inez turned to look at him for the first time. Hugh Alden was not what she had imagined when she had read the sparse lines of the advertisement. She had imagined someone older, perhaps, or rougher in the way that desperate men were rough. Instead, she found a man of perhaps 32 or 33, lean and long-legged, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of dry creek stone, somewhere between brown and gray. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers, a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head, and he had the kind of hands that told a story all by themselves, calloused and capable, the hands of a man who had built things and fixed things and never once asked anyone else to do it for him. He was looking at Cody. Not at Inez, not at Grover, but at the little boy who had lifted his head from his mother's shoulder to stare back with the uninhibited curiosity that only small children possessed. "Mr. Alden," Grover began, with the tone of a man preparing to mediate an unpleasant conversation. "I heard," Hugh said. His voice was unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to wide open spaces. He pushed away from the wall and crossed the room, stopping a respectful distance from Inez. He looked at her directly, which was something she had not experienced often enough from men in recent months, that particular brand of honest regard that neither dismissed nor devoured. "Mrs. Quinn?" "Yes." "You came all the way from Laredo?" "San Antonio most recently, Laredo before that." He nodded slowly. "Long way." "Yes," she said, "it was." There was a silence between them that was not quite uncomfortable, just waited, the way the air gets before a change in weather. Cody had reached out one small hand and was now attempting to grab the brim of Hugh's hat, which had drifted close enough to tempt a 4-year-old's fingers. Inez caught his wrist gently. "Cody, no." But Hugh leaned slightly forward, bringing the hat within easier reach. "He can touch it," he said quietly. Cody grabbed the brim with both fists and pulled it sideways with tremendous satisfaction. Hugh's expression did not change precisely, but something in it shifted, something that Inez could not yet name but that she would think about later, lying awake in the spare room of the boarding house, turning it over and over like a smooth river stone. "My advertisement did not mention children," Hugh said, straightening up. "That is true, but it also did not specifically exclude them." He looked at Inez again. "I have a ranch about 4 miles east of town. It is not large, but it is solid. I run cattle, some horses. I have a house with 2 proper rooms and a kitchen. I am not a rich man, but I have never gone hungry and I do not intend to start." He paused. "I placed that advertisement because this territory is not a place a man does well alone, and I am honest enough to admit it. I need a partner more than I need a housekeeper, if you understand what I mean by that." Inez understood exactly what he meant. She had been thinking about it for 3 months, turning over the practical realities of her situation with a clarity that grief had only sharpened rather than blurred. She had a son who needed food and shelter, and a name that people would not whisper about. She had skills, a strong back, intelligence, and a willingness to work that matched or surpassed most men she had met. What she did not have was land, money, or anyone in the world who was bound to care whether she and Cody survived the next winter. "I understand," she said. "There is one more thing," Hugh said. He seemed to choose his next words carefully, not from evasion but from a genuine desire to be precise. "If we do this, I would want it done properly. Registered, legal, witnessed. I do not want there to be any question about your standing in this community or about," he glanced at Cody again, and his voice did not change at all, "about the boys." Inez felt something crack open in her chest, not in a painful way, more the way ice cracks in spring, that first fracture that means warmth is coming. "His name is Cody," she said. "I know," Hugh said. "You told Grover, Cody Thomas Quinn." Hugh Alden looked at the boy who had now managed to pull his hat down over his own small head, drowning in the brim. "Well," he said, and the corner of his mouth shifted almost imperceptibly, "I suppose we can work on the name part." They were married 3 days later. The ceremony was brief and unadorned, performed by Judge Elias Marsh in the same land office where they had first met, which struck Inez as fittingly practical given how the whole arrangement had begun. Grover served as one witness. A woman named Pearl Hadley, who ran the boarding house where Inez had been staying and had taken an immediate and fierce liking to Cody, served as the other. Pearl wept with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a woman who wept at everything beautiful and thought very little of hiding it. Inez wore her best dress, which was blue calico, clean and pressed, and she had put her dark hair up with 2 tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother. She looked, she supposed, like what she was, a practical woman making a practical decision with her eyes open and her hands steady. Hugh wore a clean white shirt and a dark jacket that fit him well enough to suggest it had been made for him rather than purchased off a shelf. He had shaved, she noticed, and he had brought a small bunch of wildflowers, which he pressed into her hand just before the judge began speaking, with the matter-of-fact manner of a man who had decided to do a thing and saw no reason to be shy about it. She had not expected the flowers. They made the ink feel less dry. Judge Marsh read the words, and Hugh Alden said, "I do," and Inez Quinn said, "I do," and just like that she was Inez Alden, and the boy sitting cross-legged on the floor behind them, playing with a length of rope that Grover had given him to keep him occupied, had a father's name to carry into the world. Hugh signed the marriage certificate with a firm, unhesitating hand. Then he passed the pen to Inez. She signed her name beside his. When she straightened up, she found him looking at Cody again, that same unreadable expression on his face, and she thought she saw something there that she had not permitted herself to look for. Something that might, given time and the right kind of tending, become something extraordinary. The ride out to the ranch was 4 miles on a road that was more suggestion than fact, 2 wheel ruts pressed into the grass by years of wagons and horses. Hugh drove a small buckboard with Inez seated beside him and Cody wedged between them, which Cody considered to be an ideal arrangement because it gave him access to both the reins, which he was not permitted to touch, and the interesting metal fittings on Hugh's belt, which Hugh allowed him to examine to his heart's content. The ranch was exactly what Hugh had described. Not large, not grand, but solid in the way that careful work over time produces solidity. The house was hewn timber and fieldstone, with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen garden gone slightly wild from a winter of neglect. There was a barn that needed paint but not repair, a chicken coop, a horse paddock, and beyond the fence, open range rolling away toward a line of cedar that marked the creek. Inez stood in the buckboard for a moment after Hugh had jumped down, just looking at it. The late afternoon sun was laying gold across the grass and the cedar, and the air smelled of warm earth and something flowering that she could not identify, sweet and clean. "It is not much," Hugh said, looking up at her. There was something almost careful in his expression, as though he was braced for disappointment. "It is a home," Inez said. She meant it completely, and something in her voice must have communicated that because the carefulness in his face eased somewhat. He helped her down from the buckboard, and when Cody launched himself off the seat with the fearlessness of a 4-year-old who has never considered the possibility of falling badly, Hugh simply caught him, tucking the boy against his side with the casual competence of someone who has handled small creatures before. Cody grabbed a fistful of Hugh's jacket and peered around at his new surroundings with the expression of a person conducting a thorough inspection. "Chickens," Cody announced, pointing at the coop. "Yes," Hugh said. "7 of them. They have names, but I have not been very good about remembering all of them." Cody looked at him with serious gray eyes. "I will remember them." "I expect you will," Hugh said. And he carried the boy toward the house with such naturalness that Inez had to stop walking for a moment, had to take a breath, because she had not prepared herself for the particular ache of watching someone choose her son without being asked. The first weeks were an education in each other, conducted the way all real education is conducted, not in grand declarations but in the accumulation of small details. Inez learned that Hugh rose before the sun without complaint and did not speak much until he had been awake for at least an hour, which suited her fine because she was the same. She learned that he had a precision about certain things, the way tools were stored, the order in which he fed the horses, the particular way he expected the kitchen fire to be laid. That came not from stubbornness, but from the deep grooves of a man who had managed everything alone for too long. She learned that he read in the evenings, mostly newspapers and the occasional dime novel that he was slightly embarrassed about, and that he had an unexpected talent for whistling. Hugh learned that Inez was capable and direct, and that she did not need to be protected from difficulty, only from unfairness, which were two very different things. He learned that she was an extraordinary cook with limited resources, that she could mend and sew and manage a kitchen garden with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it since childhood, which she had. He learned that she wept very quietly and only at night, a private grief she kept pressed close, and that she never brought it into the daylight hours where it might become a burden to anyone else. He learned that she read to Cody every evening without fail, her voice changing for each character, her hands moving, and that the boy fell asleep to the sound of her stories with an expression of perfect contentment that Hugh found himself pausing outside the bedroom door to witness more than once. Cody adapted to the ranch with the cheerful adaptability of the very young, who have not yet developed the adult tendency to resist what is new. He followed Hugh everywhere within the first week, with the devoted persistence of a young dog, and Hugh, who had spent 6 solitary years on this piece of land, adjusted to the company with a kind of quiet wonder. He taught the boy to feed the horses, letting him hold out handfuls of grain with his small fingers spread wide and laughing when the horse's velvet lips tickled his palm. He showed him how to collect eggs without cracking them, how to tell which clouds meant rain and which were just passing through, how to read the creek for whether it had rained upstream. The boy was quick and eager, and the things Hugh showed him landed and grew. One evening, about 3 weeks into their new arrangement, Inez came out onto the porch where Hugh was sitting after supper, a habit she had not yet established because she was still finding the edges of the space that was hers to occupy. Hugh looked up from the newspaper folded on his knee, and she thought, not for the first time, that his face was better looking in the evening light than at any other time of day. Something to do with the way the shadows settled around his jaw, and the way the lamplight from inside caught the gray in his eyes. She sat down in the second chair, which she had quietly begun to think of as hers, and they watched the last of the sunset burn itself out over the cedar. "Cody called you something today," Inez said after a while. Hugh was quiet. "He called you Pa," she said, a long pause. The night insects were starting up their conversation in the grass. "I heard him," Hugh said. "I can speak with him if you would prefer he did not." Another pause, this one with a different quality. "No," Hugh said. The word was low and careful and certain. "No, I would not prefer that." Inez looked at him. He was looking out at the dark now, and his hands were still on the newspaper, very still, the way hands get when a person is feeling something they are not yet ready to put into language. "All right," Inez said softly, and they sat together in the quiet until the last of the light was gone, and the stars came out with the particular brilliance they achieve only over open country far from town. The trouble arrived, as trouble tends to in that country and that era, in the form of a man on horseback. His name was Declan Briggs, and he had ranched the land east of Hugh's property for 11 years, which was 4 years longer than Hugh, and he had used that seniority to establish certain habits that he considered rights. Chief among these was the habit of running his cattle across the creek that marked the boundary between their properties, using Hugh's land as an overflow range when his own grass ran thin in dry summers. Hugh had tolerated it before because he had not had the stock numbers to make it a material problem, and because confrontation for its own sake had never appealed to him. But in the first weeks after Inez arrived, she noticed the pattern, and she was not the kind of woman who noticed a problem and said nothing. "His cattle were across the creek line again this morning," she said one evening in early June, setting a plate on the table in front of Hugh with a precision that communicated more than the words. "That is the 3rd time in 2 weeks." "I know," Hugh said. "It is your grass." "I know that too." She sat down across from him. Cody was already eating with the focused enthusiasm of a boy who had spent the morning helping to repair fence posts and had burned through every calorie he possessed. "What are you going to do about it?" Hugh looked at her. In the weeks since their marriage, he had begun to understand that Inez Quinn, Inez Alden now, was not asking questions to hear herself ask them. She asked questions because she had already thought the problem through and wanted to know if he had arrived at the same conclusions. "I am going to ride over to Briggs's place tomorrow and have a conversation," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her own plate, and that was the end of it for the evening. The conversation with Declan Briggs did not go smoothly, largely because Briggs was the kind of man who interpreted any shift in an arrangement that had benefited him as a personal aggression. He was in his mid-40s, broad and weathered, with the particular confidence of a man who had never had his assumptions seriously challenged and did not expect to start now. He listened to Hugh's quiet, direct statement of the situation with the expression of a man who finds a mild inconvenience amusing. "You never minded before," Briggs said. "Things were different before," Hugh said from horseback, keeping his voice even. "Got yourself a wife, so now suddenly you are a big rancher." Briggs said it with a slight smile that was not a kind smile. "I have always been a rancher," Hugh said. "I am simply asking you to keep your cattle on your side of the creek line. That is the boundary, and you know it." Briggs leaned against his fence post and looked at Hugh with an assessment that was not entirely hostile but was clearly a taking of measure. "People around town are talking," he said conversationally, "about your wife, the widow who came through on the stage with another man's bastard boy." Hugh was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. "I would not say that again," he said very calmly. Something in Briggs's expression shifted. Perhaps it was the quality of the quiet, or the particular stillness in Hugh's posture, or simply the recognition that a line had been drawn clearly and that crossing it would have consequences. "Just making conversation," Briggs said with a different tone. "Keep your cattle on your side of the creek," Hugh said. He turned his horse and rode home. When he told Inez about it that evening, leaving out the comment about Cody, she listened with her hands folded on the table and her eyes on his face, reading the parts he did not say. "What did he say about us?" she asked quietly. Hugh looked at her. "Nothing worth repeating." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant a great deal more than thank you for not repeating it. "Nobody is going to speak about your son that way," Hugh said. "Not in this county." He said it with such quiet certainty that Inez had to look away, because the feeling it produced in her chest was one she was not yet ready to examine in his presence. June settled into July, and July was hot the way the Texas Hill Country does hot, which is to say comprehensively and without apology. The work of the ranch filled the long days and left them pleasantly tired in the evenings. Inez had taken to the kitchen garden with real enthusiasm, turning the neglected beds into something productive, coaxing tomatoes and beans and squash out of the hard summer ground, with a competence that she had inherited from her mother and refined by necessity. Hugh watched her work with a feeling he could not always put a name to, something that went beyond appreciation for the practical contribution and into territory that was less easy to catalog. She moved with a kind of purposeful grace, not elegant exactly, but certain, the way people move when they know their own bodies and trust them. When she laughed, which happened more often as the weeks passed, it was a sound that seemed to rearrange the quality of the air around it. He understood with a careful honesty that was characteristic of him, falling in love with his wife. He had not expected it. The arrangement had been practical, mutual, transactional in the best possible sense. He had needed a partner. She had needed security. Those needs had met cleanly in a lawyer's office over a piece of paper. He had told himself that what followed would be a functional partnership between two capable adults, warm perhaps but not, he had cautioned himself, romantic. He had underestimated Inez, or perhaps he had underestimated himself. He was not entirely sure which. The question became less theoretical one evening in the first week of July, when a sudden summer storm blew up from the south with the swiftness that Texas storms favor, rolling in dark and fast, and crackling with lightning before anyone on the ranch had entirely processed that it was happening. Hugh was in the barn when it hit, securing the horses who had been nervous for an hour before the storm arrived, as horses always know before people do. Inez was in the house, but Cody had been in the yard. Hugh heard the boy before he saw him, a small startled cry above the first crash of thunder, and he was out of the barn door and across the yard before he had consciously decided to move. The rain was coming down hard now, straight and cold, and the lightning was splitting the sky in long white forks over the cedar line. He found Cody in the middle of the yard, frozen, his face turned up to the storm with an expression caught between wonder and terror, the way children sometimes get when something is too big and too loud and too everything all at once. Hugh reached him in 4 long strides and scooped him up without breaking pace, pulling the boy tight against his chest and covering as much of him as possible as he crossed the remaining distance to the porch. Cody wrapped his arms around Hugh's neck with a grip that could have stopped a river and buried his face in his shoulder. Inez was already at the door, having seen the lightning from the kitchen window and known exactly where her son would be. She held the door open as Hugh came up the porch steps and brought the boy inside. Hugh set him down, still holding the small shoulders. "You are all right," he said quietly to Cody. "Just rain." "Just rain," Cody repeated into his chest, which he had not yet released. "Big rain," Hugh amended because honesty seemed important. "But just rain." Cody pulled back to look at him with those gray eyes that were his mother's. His hair was soaked and plastered to his head, and he had the slightly stunned look of someone who has had a very large experience very suddenly. "You came out," he said. "Yes," Hugh said. "In the rain." "Yes." Cody seemed to be processing this, weighing its significance. Then he nodded, as though it confirmed something he had been working out for a while, and turned to go find the blanket that he kept on the low shelf near the hearth. Hugh straightened up and found Inez 3 feet away, watching him with an expression that was very still and very open, the way faces get when a person stops managing what they show on them. "Thank you," she said. It was the second time she had said those particular words to him with that particular freight behind them, and they both knew it meant something that went past the surface. He was standing very close to her. Close enough that he was aware of the particular way she smelled, which was clean cotton and something faintly floral from the soap she made, and the warmth that came off her skin despite the wet and cold of the storm. She did not step back. He did not step back. "Inez," he said. He had not planned to say anything. He was not sure exactly what he intended to say. But something in his voice must have said it for him, because the expression on her face shifted in a way that was unmistakable, something softening, something opening, something that had been carefully held closed beginning to ease. "Hugh," she said very quietly. The fire in the hearth cracked. The rain hammered the roof. Cody reappeared from the corner with his blanket and inserted himself between them with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who does not yet know that he has interrupted something. "Can we have cocoa?" he asked. And Inez looked down at her son and laughed, a real laugh, warm and bright, and the moment shifted into something different but no less valuable. Hugh watched her kneel down and wrap the blanket around the boy's narrow shoulders, and felt the thing he had not yet said settle more deeply into him, no longer just a feeling he was naming but a fact he was accepting. He was in love with his wife. The cattle market in Coldwater Creek held a summer auction every August, when the ranchers who had built their herds through the spring and early summer months would bring their stock to sell before the hardest of the summer heat made the long drive north a misery. It was the biggest social event the town had outside of the 4th of July, and it brought people in from a 30-mile radius, which meant it also brought gossip, commerce, courtship, and the occasional altercation in more or less equal measure. Inez had not been to town much since the wedding. Not from reluctance, but from the simple demands of establishing a household from the ground up, which took more hours than a day reliably provided. Hugh had gone in once a week for supplies and always brought back anything she needed, and Cody had been entirely too absorbed in the ranch to agitate for town visits. But the August auction was different. Hugh needed to sell 6 steers, and Inez had been putting up preserves and jellies from the garden with a productivity that had quickly exceeded their own storage capacity. And the auction was also a market day, and she had heard from Pearl, who sent occasional notes via the weekly stage, that there were dry goods in Coldwater Creek she had not been able to source otherwise. They went to town as a family, in the buckboard, with Cody wedged between them as had become his established position on any journey, and the steers trailing behind on a lead rope. Coldwater Creek was louder and more crowded than Inez had seen it, every hitching post full, and the main street busy with people who had come in from outlying ranches for the day. She felt the eyes of the town adjust to them as they pulled in, felt the small recalibrations that happen in a community when something it has already formed an opinion about appears in front of it in person. There had been talk, she knew. There was always talk about a woman who arrived the way she had arrived, alone, and with a child and the bare minimum of means. She had heard enough of it secondhand to understand the shape of it, the various speculations about Thomas Quinn, about what kind of woman places a marriage advertisement, about the character of Hugh Alden for accepting the arrangement. She had developed a manner for facing it that was composed and direct and gave nothing away, which was a manner she had been developing her whole life. What she had not accounted for was Hugh. From the moment they stepped down from the buckboard, he was beside her. Not performatively, not with the self-conscious gallantry of a man demonstrating something to an audience, but with a simple, steady closeness that communicated ownership in the best possible sense, not of her, but of the partnership, of the unit the three of them had become. When Grover Marsh's wife came over with the bright, slightly avid expression of a woman who has prepared several questions, Hugh greeted her with pleasant courtesy, and then redirected the conversation to the cattle prices before she had gotten through more than one of them. When old Charlie Reeves, who farmed 10 miles out and had opinions about everything and everyone, made a comment about the August surplus of widows seeking husbands being rather high this year, Hugh turned on him a look so unruffled and direct that Charlie found urgent business elsewhere within 30 seconds. Inez watched him do these things and felt a warmth that she recognized now, that she had been living alongside for 2 months and learning the shape of. At the market table, she sold 8 jars of peach preserves and 6 of plum jelly inside the first hour, at prices that surprised her and apparently surprised Hugh as well, because when she brought him the money he counted it twice and then looked at her with an expression that was partly impressed and partly something more personal. "You could supply half the town," he said. "I could certainly try," she said. "We might want to think about expanding the orchard section of the garden." "I have already thought about it," she said. "I made a list." She produced a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. He took it and read it with the careful attention he gave to everything, and she watched him and thought that this was one of the things she had not expected, this particular quality of his attention. Hugh Alden took things seriously without being solemn. He listened without being passive. He was present in a way that Thomas, despite his virtues, had never quite managed to be. "This is a good list," Hugh said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He handed it back to her. Their fingers touched in the exchange, briefly, and neither of them made anything of it, but Inez held the warmth of it for the rest of the afternoon. Cody had spent the market day attached to the side of a man named Roscoe Dale, who was Hugh's nearest neighbor to the north and the closest thing Hugh had to a friend in the county. A wiry, sun-damaged man of about 40 with a kind face, and a remarkable collection of folded paper animals that he produced from his vest pockets for Cody's entertainment. By the end of the afternoon, Cody had a paper horse, a paper dog, and something that Roscoe insisted was a cat but which looked more like a misshapen rectangle, and he had informed Roscoe with the directness of the very young that Roscoe could come and visit whenever he wished. "He has invited half the county to the ranch," Hugh said to Inez, watching Cody explain the paper horse to Roscoe with extensive commentary. "He is hospitable," Inez said. "He gets it from somewhere," Hugh said, and when she glanced at him she found him already looking at her. The drive home in the late afternoon was golden and quiet, the buckboard rocking gently over the road, Cody asleep between them with his paper animals clutched in both fists and his head tipped against Inez's side. The sun was doing the thing it does over that country at that hour, painting everything amber and rust and deep gold, and the cedar along the creek was dark against it, and the sky above was the color of old copper. "It was a good day," Inez said. "Yes," Hugh said. "Coldwater Creek is not as bad as I thought it might be." "It is not a bad town," he agreed. "It is a small town which is different." She watched the landscape for a moment. "I heard Mrs. Patterson say something at the market table." "What did she say?" "She said she was glad you had found someone." Inez paused. "She made it sound like you had been alone a long time." Hugh was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a rut in the road. "6 years," he said. "Since my mother died. The ranch was hers originally. She left it to me. And before that, there was a woman I was set to marry," he said without any particular drama. "This was 8 years ago, back in Missouri. She thought better of it. She was not wrong to. I did not have much to offer then." "What happened to Missouri?" "I came to Texas," he said simply. "I decided that if I was going to build something, I wanted to build it on my own land, and this was the land I could afford." Inez looked at the ranch as they came within sight of it, the house warm in the setting sun, the barn and paddock and the garden and the wide open land beyond. "You built something good," she said. He glanced at her. In the amber light, his eyes were more brown than gray, and there was something in them that was not the careful reserve she had grown accustomed to reading, something more open. "We are building something better," he said, and his voice was quiet and certain in the way that things are when they are not performances but convictions. Inez felt the warmth in her chest spread out like sunrise. She said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say, but she shifted fractionally on the seat so that her shoulder was against his, and he did not shift away, and they drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was about as far from empty as a silence can get. August came to its end, and September arrived with a welcome loosening of the heat, the afternoons beginning to smell of turned earth and change. The cattle herd was coming along. The garden was being put up for winter in orderly rows of preserves and dried goods. The house had been reorganized in ways that made it more functional and more, Inez thought, like a place that had been truly inhabited rather than merely occupied. It was in September that the question of Cody's name came to the surface in the way that things do when two people have been circling something without quite landing on it directly. They were at the table after supper, Hugh going over the ranch accounts with the serious concentration he always brought to numbers, Cody long since asleep, and Inez mending a shirt by lamplight. It was a quiet evening, companionable, the kind of evening that had become the texture of their life together. "I have been thinking," Hugh said without looking up from the accounts, "about whether you would want to change Cody's surname on the registry." Inez set down her mending and looked at him. He was still looking at the accounts, but his pen had stopped moving. "To Alden," she said. "If you wanted," he said carefully. "It is not a small thing. Thomas Quinn was his father. I would not presume to replace that or suggest it should be erased." "Thomas is gone," Inez said. The words were simple and without bitterness, which was something she had arrived at slowly and with real work. "He gave Cody what he could, his dark hair and his name and the fact of existing at all. But he is not here and he will not be here, and the man who is teaching Cody to read the weather and carry eggs and care for horses is sitting at that table." Hugh looked up then. "I would like him to have your name," Inez said, "if you would like him to have it." Something crossed Hugh's face that was rawer than his usual expression, less filtered. "I would like that," he said, "very much." They had the paperwork drawn up the following week, and Cody Thomas Alden was registered in the county records of Coldwater Creek, Texas, in the third week of September, 1878, with two parents' signatures on the document and a judge's stamp that made it law. Cody himself was informed of the change on the way home from town, seated between his parents in the buckboard as always, turning the new concept over in his small mind with the thoroughness he applied to all information. "Alden," he said, testing it. "Alden," Hugh confirmed. "Like you." "Like me," Hugh said. "If that suits you." Cody appeared to complete his assessment. "It suits me," he said, with the gravity of a 4-year-old signing a treaty, and then turned his attention to the horizon where a hawk was riding the afternoon thermals in long, patient circles. Inez looked across the boy's head and found Hugh looking back at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen it. It was not a performance for the boy or a fulfillment of a contract. It was something that came from a place in him that was genuine and deep, and it landed in her chest with a permanence that she recognized as love. Not the tentative beginning of something, not the cautious possibility she had been carrying for weeks. The real and entire thing. She had not planned to fall in love with her husband. She had planned to be practical and capable, and to build a good functional life with a decent man. She had achieved all of those things, and somewhere between the summer storms and the market days and the evenings on the porch and the sound of him teaching her son to whistle, she had done considerably more than plan. It was Roscoe Dale who created the occasion for the first honest declaration between them, entirely without intending to. He came to supper one evening in October, as Cody's standing invitation had made a habit about once a month, and he brought with him a bottle of decent whiskey, and the news that Declan Briggs had decided to sell his East Ranch and move to Houston, which apparently suited his wife considerably more than the hill country had. Briggs selling, Hugh said, over the supper table. Signed the papers last week, Roscoe said, helping himself to more of Inez's cornbread. His missus has been after him to sell for 3 years. She wanted to be near her sister in Houston. I suppose the drought last summer finally gave her the argument she needed. He looked at Hugh. That is good land east of the creek line, Hugh. Good grass, solid soil. Briggs never worked it as well as it deserved. I know, Hugh said. You should think about it. I am thinking about it, Hugh said, and looked at Inez. She looked back at him steadily. The look said several things. Yes, they should think about it. Yes, it would expand the ranch substantially. Yes, she understood what that kind of growth required and was not afraid of it. And yes, she was a full partner in this decision and expected to be treated as one. Hugh received all of those messages with the accuracy of a man who had been learning to read her for 6 months. "We will talk about it," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." Roscoe looked back and forth between them with the expression of a man watching a very efficient and slightly mysterious form of communication. "Well," he said, "I will just have some more cornbread then." After Roscoe left and Cody was in bed, Hugh and Inez sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and talked it through the way they talked everything through now, with the honest directness that had become their habit and that Inez prized above almost everything else in their life together. They talked about the money, about what they had and what they would need and how it could be managed. They talked about the labor, about whether they could take on a hired hand, about the expansion of the herd. They talked about the risk and the potential in equal measure. And at the end of it, when the lamp was burning low and the decision had been arrived at collectively and practically, Hugh looked at her across the table in the dimming light and said, "Inez," she waited. "I want you to know," he said, choosing his words with the care he always brought to things that mattered, "that this is not the arrangement I planned on." She looked at him. "When I placed that advertisement," he said, "I told myself I was looking for a practical solution to a practical problem. And I believed that entirely when I said it. But what I have now is something that I did not plan for and would not trade for anything in this world." He stopped. Then more quietly, "What I have now is you, and Cody, and this." He spread one hand slightly, indicating the room, the house, the life they had built. "I did not expect to love you. I find that I do completely. I wanted you to know that before we spend more money on land." The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window, and Inez heard the cedar outside moving in the night wind, and she felt her heart fill with the particular complete fullness of a thing that has been waiting to arrive and has finally done so. "Hugh," she said, "yes, I love you too." She said it simply, the way she said most important things, directly and without decoration. "I came here for Cody's sake and I will never regret that, but what I stayed for, what I am here for, is you. You should know that." He reached across the table and took her hand, which was warm and calloused and capable, and held it in both of his. And they sat like that for a long time while the lamp burned down, and the night sounds filled the silence around them. And outside, the Texas hill country stretched away in every direction under a full October moon, vast and silver and indifferent to human arrangements but deeply, irreversibly unable to diminish the specific warmth of two people who have found each other when they least expected it. The land negotiation for the Briggs property took most of November and the beginning of December to complete, not because the price was unreasonable, but because the legal transfer of land in 1878, Texas, involved a Baroque succession of paperwork and official stamps and notarizations that required multiple trips to town and considerable patience. Hugh handled the legal machinery, and Inez handled the financial management, which she did with a precision that surprised the bank's representative, a man named Stovall who had not expected to be negotiating with a woman, and adjusted his expectations upward with what Inez considered commendable speed. They acquired an additional 320 acres east of the creek in December, formally expanding the Alden Ranch to a size that would allow them to double the herd in the following spring, if the grass held and the rain came on schedule. Hugh hired a young man named Eli Sharp, 17 years old and the younger son of a farrier in town, who showed up with his own horse and a willingness to work that compensated for his youth and somewhat limited experience. He was good with the cattle and even better with the horses, which turned out to be the more critical skill, and he learned fast enough that Hugh had no regrets about the hire. Cody adopted Eli with the same comprehensive enthusiasm he had brought to Roscoe Dale, the paper animals, and the ranch chickens. Eli, who had come from a family where he was at the bottom of a long stack of older brothers, and had spent most of his life being the least important person in any room, found Cody's wholehearted attention both flattering and slightly overwhelming. He taught Cody to braid rope out of self-defense, on the theory that a child with a project was less likely to insert himself into whatever task Eli was trying to complete. Christmas arrived in that particular Texas hill country way that was less white and more gold, dry cold at night and bright during the days, the cedar holding its dark green against the brown of the dormant grass. Inez had decorated the house with what the land provided, dried berries and cedar branches and candles in the windows, and the result was something she was quietly proud of. Hugh had found, in Coldwater Creek, a carved wooden horse that was approximately the size and proportion of a real one, if you imagined it from a considerable height, and he had wrapped it in brown paper and put it under the cedar branch they had cut for the purpose. Cody's response to the horse on Christmas morning was physically comprehensive, involving several circuits of the room at speed, and a period of time lying flat on the floor holding the horse above his face, and rotating it to examine it from every possible angle. Hugh watched this from the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee and an expression that Inez, watching him watch her son, thought was the most purely happy she had yet seen on his face. She came and stood beside him in the doorway. He put his free arm around her shoulders without looking away from Cody, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that and watched their son discover a Christmas morning. Winter on the ranch was quieter than the other seasons, but not idle. There was always maintenance, always fence line to walk, always equipment to repair, always planning for the spring to be done. Hugh and Inez spent the long evenings at the kitchen table, often with maps and account books and lists, building the next version of what they were creating together. They talked about a larger kitchen garden in the spring. They talked about whether to run more of the range to hay for winter feeding. They talked about whether the house might eventually need a third room. That particular conversation about the third room arrived naturally out of the other conversations and settled between them with the particular weight of something that means more than its immediate practical surface. If the ranch continues to grow the way it has, Inez said, looking at the account figures with the focused expression that figures always produced in her, we will be able to manage the addition by next fall. That is what I was thinking, Hugh said. He was looking at the figures too, but he had also been looking at her, occasionally, in the way that he had been doing more and more in the months since October. Cody will need his own room eventually, she said. He will, Hugh agreed, a pause, and there may be other reasons for more space. She looked up from the figures. He was looking at her directly with that quality of honest attention that she had loved about him almost from the beginning. Yes, she said, holding his gaze, there may be. The February night was cold and clear, and the stars over the hill country were extraordinary. And inside the Alden house, the lamplight was warm on the table between two people who had come to each other by a practical arrangement and built something that was the opposite of practical, something that was alive and warm and expanding. Spring of 1879 came in with good rain that soaked into the soil and brought the grass up strong and green, which was everything a rancher wanted and more than most years provided. The expansion of the ranch into the former Briggs property was already showing returns, with the cattle numbers climbing and the grass holding the weight of the expanded herd without protest. In April, the wildflowers came up the way Texas wildflowers do, which is extravagantly. The bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and black-eyed Susans coming in waves along the fence lines and across the open range and up the rises and down into the creek hollows, so thick and bright that riding through them felt like something out of a story. Cody, who was 5 now and entering the age of strong opinions and longer sentences, declared the bluebonnets to be his favorite and spent an afternoon making a crown of them that he presented to his mother, with the ceremony of a knight presenting a trophy to his queen. Inez wore the crown for the rest of the afternoon, somewhat lopsidedly, while she worked in the kitchen garden. Hugh, coming in from the south pasture, caught sight of her from the fence line and stopped his horse and just looked at her for a moment. His wife in her garden with a crown of bluebonnets slipping down her dark hair and her hands in the earth, and felt something in his chest that he had no word for and did not need one. On an evening in April, 3 weeks after the bluebonnets came in, Inez told Hugh that she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, which was where they had their most important conversations, which seemed fitting. She told him directly and steadily, which was the only way she knew to tell important things, and she watched his face move through something that started as stillness and ended as a kind of illumination, a brightness in those dry creekstone eyes that she had never seen there before. He stood up from the table and came around to her and took her face in his calloused hands and looked at her with the full force of his attention, which was considerable. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was who he was. "I am very well," she said. Then he kissed her, which was quiet and full and real, and she put her hands over his and held them there against her face for a moment, and the lamp between them cast their shadows together on the wall in one long, inseparable shape. Cody was informed the following morning that there would be a baby in the autumn, and he received this news with a period of thoughtful processing that lasted approximately 90 seconds before producing the question of whether the baby would want to play with his rope braiding kit. He was reassured that in time, and with great patience on his part, the baby would very likely be an enthusiastic participant in rope braiding, and this seemed to satisfy the most pressing of his concerns. The summer of 1879 was good in the way that the best years in that country are good, not easy exactly, because nothing about ranching in the Texas Hill Country is ever easy, but full of work and progress and small pleasures and the steady building of things. The herd grew. The kitchen garden surpassed even the previous year's production, and Inez expanded her preserves business to supply 2 of the general stores in Coldwater Creek, which brought in a reliable income stream that Hugh declared to be, in his understated way, not nothing. Eli proved himself so thoroughly over the first year that Hugh gave him a small raise and a more substantial role in managing the cattle, which Eli accepted with the quiet pride of a young man who has been told that his work means something. Roscoe Dale came for supper monthly with his paper animals, and his good humor and his genuine affection for the whole family, which had by this point extended to include a devoted attachment to Inez's cooking that he did not attempt to disguise. Pearl Hadley came out from town twice during the summer, driving her own small buggy with the competence of a woman who had managed independently for a great many years, and she and Inez spent those visits talking and working in the kitchen and the garden while Pearl dispensed wisdom about motherhood and the peculiarities of Coldwater Creek society with equal generosity. Pearl had, Inez reflected, become a real friend, the kind that a woman in a new place needs and does not always find, and she was grateful for it in the way that you are grateful for things that make an already good life better. In August, Inez wrote a letter to Thomas Quinn's sister in Laredo, a woman named Claire who had been kind to Inez and Cody during the difficult months after Thomas's death. She told Claire about the ranch and about Hugh and about Cody, who was thriving and happy, and called himself Cody Alden now with a completeness that left no doubt about where he belonged. She told Claire about the baby coming. She told her she hoped Claire would come and visit when she could. Claire wrote back within a month to say she would, and that she was glad, and that Thomas would have wanted Inez and Cody to be exactly where they were. Inez read that letter at the kitchen table with Hugh sitting beside her, doing the accounts, and she felt the last of the grief she had been carrying settle into something that was not gone but was resolved, something that had found its proper place in the past without pulling her backward away from the present. She folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept the things that mattered and reached across the account book to take Hugh's hand. He looked up. She smiled at him. He turned his hand under hers and held it. The baby came in October, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was that high clear blue that autumn produces after the first cold nights have sharpened everything. Pearl came out from town the week prior and stayed, which Inez had been quietly grateful for, though she would not have admitted to the full extent of her gratitude. Hugh was present in the way he was present for everything important, which was to say completely and without flinching, even when Pearl gently but firmly kept him on the other side of the door for the duration. The child was a boy. Hugh was told this information in the doorway, and his response was to sit down somewhat abruptly on the porch bench and put his face in his hands for a moment, which was the most undone Inez had ever heard of him being. Cody, who had spent the morning on the porch with Eli and Roscoe in a state of barely suppressed agitation, immediately climbed onto the bench beside Hugh and put his arm around him with the instinctive care of a child who loves someone and recognizes when they need comfort. "Pa," Cody said, "are you all right?" Hugh lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were bright. "Yes," he said, "I am very, very all right." He was brought into the bedroom shortly after, where Inez was sitting propped against the pillows with the exhausted, luminous expression of a woman who has accomplished something extraordinary, which she had. The baby was in her arms, red and small and emphatic in his initial reaction to the world. Hugh sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and the look on his face was not something Inez had words for, but she kept it, stored it whole in the place where she kept the most important things. He held the baby carefully, with the focused gravity of a man handling something precious. The baby grabbed one of his fingers with the instinctive fierce grip of the newly born. "He's strong," Hugh said very quietly. "Yes," Inez said. "What do you want to name him?" She had thought about this. "James," she said, "for your mother's father, if you told me right." Hugh looked at her. "You remembered that. You mentioned it once in September." She looked at the baby in his arms. "James William Alden, if you like William." "I like William," he said. He looked down at the baby. "James William Alden." He said it as though he was learning something by heart. Cody appeared in the doorway with the deliberate stealth of a child trying to be noticed without appearing to try, and Inez beckoned to him. He came to the bedside and peered at the baby with the critical scrutiny of an older sibling conducting an assessment. "He is very small," Cody said. "You were small too," Inez said. "I do not remember that." "I remember it," she said. "Come and sit up here." He climbed up carefully and settled beside her, looking at the baby in Hugh's arms. After a long moment of assessment, he pronounced, "He can have the rope braiding kit when he is big enough." "That is very generous," Hugh said. "I know," Cody agreed modestly. Pearl, from the doorway, made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob, and retreated to the kitchen to make tea with the enthusiasm of a woman who needs an outlet for her feelings. James William Alden grew in the way that healthy, well-loved babies grow, with a speed that parents always find slightly startling, as though the child is making a point. By November, he was filling out and learning to focus his eyes on faces, and he had a habit of watching whoever was in the room with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he was storing information for later use. Cody took his role as older brother seriously, and in ways that were sometimes helpful and occasionally creative. He kept up a running narration for the baby's benefit throughout most of his waking hours, informing James about the chickens, the horses, the state of the weather, and various other matters of ranch life, with the conviction that all of this information was urgent and necessary. James's response to this narration was generally positive, which encouraged Cody to continue. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was quieter than the previous one, in the way that things are quieter when they are settled rather than being established. The ranch was running well, the accounts were in a good state, the house was warm and full, and the family that had been assembled by practical necessity and plain paper documents had become, through months of work and storms and small daily choices, something that was real and rooted and flourishing. Hugh had finished the addition to the house in late fall, before the cold came in properly. A third room, built well, with a window that faced east so that whoever slept in it would have the morning light. It was Cody's room, and Cody moved into it with the gravity of someone taking up an important post, arranging his things with the same thoroughness that his mother brought to everything. On a cold December evening, with James asleep in his cradle and Cody in his room, and the fire going strong in the kitchen hearth, Inez and Hugh were sitting in the chairs they had been sitting in together since the beginning, with the lamplight between them and the quiet of the ranch all around. Inez looked up from the book she was reading and found Hugh watching her. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He considered for a moment, which was characteristic. He was never a man who answered without thinking, which she had come to trust absolutely. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "that 2 years ago I was sitting in this room alone in the winter dark, and I had decided that this was simply how it was going to be. A man and a piece of land and the work to be done. Nothing more." He paused. "And I am thinking about what a very small imagination I had." Inez looked at him across the fire-lit room. Her husband, this quiet, steady, extraordinary man who had caught her son in a thunderstorm and given him his name and built a third room with his own hands and learned the language of her, who she was and what she needed and what she was building. "Hugh," she said. "Yes. I am very glad I answered that advertisement." The corner of his mouth moved. "So am I." She stood up and crossed the room to him, and he made room for her, which was something he had been doing since before the ink was dry on the certificate in Grover's office, and she settled against his side in the chair that was really too small for two people but served the purpose entirely well, and his arm came around her, and they sat together in the warm room while the fire talked to itself, and the cold pressed against the walls outside and could not get in. The spring of 1880 came in again with the wildflowers, and with the wildflowers came Claire Quinn from Laredo, just as she had promised. She arrived on the stage in mid-March, a small dark-haired woman with Thomas's eyes and none of his restlessness, practical and warm, and immediately at home, with the chaos of a house containing a crawling baby and a 5-year-old boy who had opinions about everything. Cody accepted her with enthusiasm, and almost immediately began showing her everything about the ranch with the comprehensive thoroughness that he had applied to every new person in his world. Claire followed him from the chicken coop, to the horse paddock to the vegetable garden, receiving information about each chicken's individual character, and the proper way to test soil moisture with the solemnity of a student attending important lectures. In the evenings, while Hugh was on the porch with Roscoe, who had come over at Inez's invitation to fill out the supper table, Claire and Inez sat at the kitchen table with James between them and talked the way that women talk when they have privacy and trust, which is to say about everything. "He is good," Claire said, meaning Hugh in the way that required no clarification. "He is," Inez said. She was nursing James, who was conducting himself with the focused efficiency he always brought to meals. "Thomas was not bad," Claire said carefully, "but he was not this." "No," Inez agreed without bitterness, "he was not this." "You look well," Claire said, "better than I have ever seen you." Inez looked down at James, then out through the window at the darkening spring evening, then across the table at Claire. "I am happy," she said, simply the way she said true things. "I did not know that was coming. I did not plan for it, but here it is." Claire reached across the table and covered Inez's hand with hers. "Here it is," she agreed. Claire stayed for 2 weeks, and when she left she promised to return in the autumn, and she kept that promise, and the one after it, until Coldwater Creek and the Alden Ranch became a fixed point on her calendar, and a place that felt like family, which it was. The years that followed were shaped by the particular rhythms of a working ranch in the Texas Hill Country. Seasons of hard work and easier work, years of good rain and years of drought, the cycle of cattle and horses and the market. The school that Coldwater Creek established in 1881, where Cody went and excelled, because he had been read to every evening of his life, and arrived already knowing more than most children twice his age. Hugh and Roscoe had been elected to the County Commissioners' Committee in 1881, which meant periodic trips to the county seat that Hugh bore with patience if not enthusiasm, because the political machinery of the Texas frontier was cumbersome and often frustrating. But someone had to participate in it, and Hugh was the kind of man who understood that civic responsibility was not optional for someone who expected to be treated as a full member of a community. It was at one of those commissioner meetings that the question of the Apache communities to the west was raised, not for the first time and not for the last, but with a particular urgency that season because there had been disputes about water rights along several creek systems that affected both the settlers and the Apache bands who had used those waterways for generations before any settler arrived. The injustice of the situation was not lost on Hugh, who had read enough history and seen enough of the territory to understand that the people being asked to concede were almost always the ones who had been there longest and had the fewest legal protections. He said so at the meeting, with the quiet directness that had always characterized him, and it created a disruption that lasted the better part of an hour and made him briefly unpopular with half the room. He did not change his position. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated, repeatedly and clearly, that a water dispute had two sides and that the resolution could not be just if one of those sides had no legal representation in the room. He came home from that meeting and told Inez about it at the kitchen table, and she listened with the full attention she always brought to things that mattered. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing yet," he said, "but it will come up again." "Are you going to keep saying it?" "Yes," he said simply. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "Good," she said. He did keep saying it at every subsequent meeting with a persistence that eventually shifted the conversation if not the outcome, which was the nature of those decades in that territory, incremental and incomplete but not entirely fruitless. The particular water dispute he had raised was eventually resolved through a formal negotiation rather than a unilateral decision by the settlers, which was not a perfect outcome, but was better than what would have happened without the dissent. Inez had always known Hugh to be a good man. This confirmed the depth of that goodness, the kind that holds when it costs something. James began walking in the summer of 1880 with the determined enthusiasm of a person who has been waiting too long to get on with things. He walked early and fast and was immediately interested in horses, which Cody explained to everyone was obvious because of the Christmas horse, as though the carved wooden toy had been a formative influence on a 9-month-old's character. Hugh found this theory charming and James's horse obsession extremely useful, because a child who loves horses tends to help care for them well. In the fall of 1881, Inez discovered she was expecting a third child, and she told Hugh with the same directness she had told him about James, and his response was the same illumination, the same immediate concerned question about her health, and the same kiss afterward that was quiet and full and real. "3 children," he said, holding her face in his hands in the kitchen in October, with the smell of her baking all around them and the ranch sounds outside and Cody's voice somewhere beyond the window explaining something to Eli. "3 children," she confirmed. He looked at her with those Dry Creek stone eyes that she had been reading for 3 years now and knew as well as she knew her own, and what was in them was something that she thought very few people were lucky enough to see in a life. Not just love, though it was profoundly that. Something more specific, the particular expression of a person who has received more than they believed they deserved and has not quite stopped marveling at it. "I did not plan for this," he said, and it echoed what he had said by the fire in December, and it still meant the same thing. "Neither did I," she said, "and here it is." The third child, born in the May of 1882, was a girl. They named her Clara Rose Alden, in a nod to both Claire Quinn and the particular wildness of the spring roses that grew along the creek fence that year, in a profusion so extravagant it seemed designed specifically for the occasion. Clara was, from the first, a person of strong opinions and excellent lungs, and she made both of these qualities comprehensively known to anyone within range. Cody, now 7, received her with the magnanimity of someone who has already been through this process and knows that siblings improve with time. James, who was a year and a half and deeply interested in everything, regarded his new sister with the same focused analytical attention he brought to horses and chickens and weather, and reached out to touch her face with one careful finger with an expression of genuine wonder. "Soft," he said, which was his entire review, but a thorough one. Hugh held Clara the way he had held James, with that same careful precision and the same brightness in his eyes. But Inez noticed something additional now, something that came from 3 years of watching this man with her children. He held Clara with the ease of a father who has done this before. The confidence of experience had been added to the love of the first time, and the combination was something she found almost unbearably beautiful to witness. Pearl Hadley came and stayed for a week after Clara was born, as she had for James, and she declared the baby to be the most magnificent creature she had seen since James, who had been the most magnificent since Cody, and she appeared to hold all 3 of these opinions simultaneously without perceiving any contradiction. Summer came and went, and the ranch continued its steady growth, the herd now at a size that Hugh had not quite imagined when he had written up the first advertisement 3 years before. Eli Sharp was 19 now, and had become something close to a ranch foreman, managing the daily work with a competence that reflected both his natural ability and the 3 years of mentorship Hugh had given him. He boarded in a small room attached to the barn that Hugh had built for the purpose, and he ate supper at the Alden table 3 times a week, which had become as established a habit as any other part of the household routine. Inez's preserves business had expanded to supply 4 stores in 2 towns, and she had begun teaching her methods to 2 of the women from the farms north of Coldwater Creek, which had created a small informal cooperative that she managed with the quiet efficiency of someone who has always known how to organize without needing to advertise the fact. On a Thursday evening in August 1882, with the children in bed and the ranch quiet and the summer stars out in their full hill country extravagance, Inez and Hugh sat on the porch in their chairs and looked out at the land they had built together. The garden was full and producing. The barn was sound. The horses stood quiet in the paddock. The creek ran clear beyond the cedar line, and the Briggs land, the Alden land now, stretched away to the east under the starlight, solid and real and theirs. "I want to show you something," Hugh said. He went inside and came back with a piece of paper, which he handed to her in the lamplight that spilled through the door. It was the original registry document from their marriage, the one that Grover and Pearl had witnessed in the land office in May of 1878. She had not seen it since it was filed. She looked at it for a moment, the careful official language, the judge's stamp, the 2 signatures side by side at the bottom. Hugh Alden and Inez Quinn. "Why did you get this out?" she asked. "I needed to check something in the property description," he said. "It is referenced in the deed records, and I sat there looking at it for a long time." She looked up at him. "I was thinking about that day," he said, "when you walked in with Cody on your hip. I was in the back of the room and you came in and started talking to Grover, and I watched you and I thought, that woman is going to change something." "What kind of something?" she asked. "I did not know yet," he said, "but something significant. You had that quality about you, like a thing that has already decided." She looked at the document again. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said, "but you did not show it. That is a skill I learned young." She folded the paper carefully. "You had flowers. I thought it was a reasonable thing to bring. It was more than reasonable, she said. It was the right thing. She handed the document back to him. Everything about that day was more than what I expected. He took the document and set it on the small table beside his chair. So was everything after, he said. They were quiet together for a while. The night sounds were the same sounds that had accompanied 100 evenings like this one. The insects in the grass, the occasional shift of a horse in the paddock, the distant call of a night bird along the creek. Familiar and sustaining, the music of a life that had found its shape and was producing it reliably day after day. Hugh, Inez said. Yes, I think we have done well. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land, and then he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was everything she had ever found in it. The steadiness and the warmth and the honesty, and beneath all of it, bedrock deep, that particular brightness. We have done extraordinarily, he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and he held it in both of his the way he had at the kitchen table the night she had told him she loved him. And they sat like that under the August stars while the ranch breathed around them. And inside the house, their 3 children slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children who have never known a night when they were not safe. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, not unnoticed, but without the particular weight that difficult years carry. Cody grew into a boy who was his father's shadow in the best sense, learning the ranch from the ground up with a seriousness and competence that made Hugh quietly proud in the particular way that parents are proud of children, completely, and without needing to say it constantly. By the time he was 10, Cody Alden could read weather signs and manage a small cattle drive and fix most basic equipment faults, and he did all of it with the matter-of-fact capability that was as much his mother in him as his adoptive father. He also read voraciously, fueled by Inez's lifelong habit and by a subscription Hugh arranged to a newspaper from San Antonio that arrived weekly on the stage. Cody read the newspaper with the thoroughness of a boy who intends to know things, folding it and discussing it at supper with observations that occasionally surprised even Hugh. James developed the predicted deep affinity for horses, and by 5 was already riding with a natural balance that Eli declared to be a gift rather than a skill, something some people have in their bones. Hugh taught him the same careful horsemanship he had practiced himself, not just riding but the full relationship, the reading of a horse's temperament, the proper care, the respect. James absorbed it all with the focused attention that characterized everything he did. Clara was loud and bright and funny, the way some children are funny almost from birth, with a natural comic timing that made even serious Hugh's eyes crinkle at the corners. She was devoted to Cody in the way that small sisters are devoted to older brothers who have been kind to them from the beginning, and she was devoted to the chickens in a way that was possibly more intense, giving each one a name and a detailed personality and maintaining firm views about their individual feeding schedules that she communicated to whoever happened to be passing the chicken coop with equal firmness. On the occasion of Hugh and Inez's 5th wedding anniversary, in May of 1883, Roscoe Dale organized what he described as a small supper, and which turned out to involve Pearl Hadley and Claire Quinn and Eli Sharp, and the Reverend and Mrs. Chambers from the Coldwater Creek Church, and approximately 14 other people from the surrounding ranches and farms, all of whom appeared at the Alden Ranch on a Saturday evening with food and good wishes, and the particular kind of collective warmth that a community extends to people it has come to regard as its own. Inez stood on the porch in the May evening and looked at the yard full of people who had come to celebrate her life, and felt, beside her husband's hand in hers, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of belonging, not to a place, though she had that too, but to a community, a collection of people who knew her and saw her and had chosen to include her. She had come to Coldwater Creek with nothing but a child and a need, and she had found a husband who had given her son his name before the ink was dry and had gone on to give the boy, and her, and their children after that, everything else that a person can give, which is to say his whole heart, every day, without reservation. Hugh watched her from beside her on the porch, his wife in the May evening with their children moving through the gathered crowd, Cody tall and easy-moving among the adults, James holding a hoarse conversation with one of the ranch men from 2 properties north, Clara dispensing opinions to Pearl with the confidence of a 3-year-old who has always been listened to. He thought about the land office in May 1878, and the woman who had walked in with a 4-year-old on her hip and more courage in her steady gray eyes than most men he had ever known. He thought about the paper that had made them a family, the ink on the marriage certificate, the ink on Cody's registry, the ink on the land deed and the bank documents, and every official record that translated the real and living thing between them into the language of law and public record. The ink had dried on all of it years ago. Everything it represented was still warm and growing. He leaned close and said quietly into her dark hair, "Are you happy?" She turned and looked at him with those gray eyes, and what was in them was not the composed, careful steadiness of the woman who had walked into the land office with her defenses up in her chin level. What was in them now was entirely open, entirely present, entirely his. "Extraordinarily," she said, and the word landed between them with the weight of a full and honest truth. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and around them the voices of their community filled the spring evening, and the land ran away to the cedar line in the last of the western light, and the Alden ranch stood solid and sound as the foundation of everything they had built, which was not small, not practical, not temporary. It was a life, complete and flourishing, assembled from the simplest and most courageous materials: honesty, work, and the willingness of 2 people to choose each other every day, starting from the day when a quiet man leaned against the wall of a land office and reached forward so that a small boy could touch the brim of his hat. Cody found them on the porch later in the evening, when most of the guests had gathered in the yard around the fire that Roscoe had built with the slightly excessive enthusiasm he brought to fires. Cody was 10, and he was at the age where he was beginning to understand things that he had known for years in a different, deeper way, understanding them not just as facts but as the substance they were made of. He leaned against the porch railing and looked at his parents the way he sometimes looked at the horses or the creek or the sky, with a careful, appreciating attention. "Eli said the calf count is up to 42 this season," he said. "I know," Hugh said. "That is good. It is very good." A pause. The fire crackled in the yard. James's laugh carried across the air, high and bright. "Pa," Cody said. "Yes." Cody was quiet for a moment, working up to something with the characteristic thoroughness that was his mother entirely. Then, "I am glad you put that advertisement in the paper." Hugh was still for a moment, and then he looked at Inez, and she looked back at him, and between them passed something that had no language but needed none. "So am I," Hugh said to his son. "More than you know." Cody nodded, satisfied with this, and pushed off the railing and went back to the fire and the crowd and the voices. And Hugh and Inez stood on the porch of the house they had built together and held on to the evening and each other. And the Texas hill country stretched away around them in all directions, wide and breathing and fully, completely alive.